plastics will play as large a role in peace as they do in war.
The 20th century gave rise to the chemical industry. It has revolutionised our world and transformed the way we live.
After the Second World War, there was a sudden burst of activity in the chemicals industry, and the environment has become flooded with new chemicals.
Over 80,000 chemicals are used in everyday products. We handle them. They're in our water, our food, and in the air we breathe. It's impossible to escape them. But now there's growing concern that these chemicals are not safe.
There's no requirement to show that these chemicals are actually safe before people are exposed to them.
We basically, in the US, consider chemicals safe until proven otherwise.
Experts believe the rise in the use of industrial chemicals is linked to issues like lower IQ, cancer, and reproductive problems. So, without adequate testing of the safety of chemicals, are we in the midst of an uncontrolled human experiment? Chemical pollution begins in the womb. From the moment we're conceived, our bodies are exposed to a cocktail of potential toxicants.
Mothers are being exposed to chemicals during pregnancy. These chemicals are somehow finding their way across the placenta, directly into the fetus, and having an impact on the normal pattern of development.
The dangers of chemicals like mercury and lead have been well established. But less is known about other chemicals which interfere or perturb with our endocrine system. This system of glands produces hormones that regulate virtually every aspect of human health, beginning at our most vulnerable time in the womb.
Our hormone system controls who we are. It controls our basic physiology as adults, but our endocrine system is absolutely essential during development.
Timing is actually critical. There's this concept of windows of susceptibility where an agent can have really adverse effects if it's present at a specific time during development. For example, something can cause an adverse effect if it's exposed on day 18, but not if it's exposed on day 20. It can be that critical.
It's like you throw a monkey wrench into a system and it can never recover from it. So you'll have permanent change.
In plastics and in the lining of cans, you'll find bisphenol A or BPA. In cosmetics, skin creams and perfumes, there's phthalates. Foods sprayed with pesticides. Carpets, furniture and electronics, all infused with fire retardants. It's the chemical soup of modern life. The concern is our bodies mistake them for hormones.
Endocrine disrupting chemicals can act like hormones or they can interfere with hormones. And if there's any perturbation, including an extremely small perturbation due to a deficiency in a hormone, an excess of a hormone, or some sort of outside chemical like an endocrine disruptor, that can have very devastating consequences.
One of the most researched chemicals found in plastics is BPA, which mimics the female hormone estrogen.
This is the estrogen molecule, and it binds to the estrogen receptor, rather like a lock and key, switches on the receptor and carries out the estrogenic properties. BPA, the molecule below here, you can see has very similar sort of structure. And if you superimpose them on top of each other, you can see the hydroxyl groups line up really nicely. So that will be a key for the lock.
So it's quite possible that BPA would have very similar effects to estrogen when it binds.
Yep, no, it will have almost identical effects. The only difference will be the magnitude of the effects for BPA are lower than estrogen because it doesn't fit that receptor quite as well.
The supply of estrogen to a fetus is exquisitely controlled by the placenta in order to achieve normal male and female development.
The placenta itself detoxifies the estrogens from the mother, the natural estrogens, and stops them crossing into the fetus. Unfortunately, some of these synthetic chemicals, and particularly things like bisphenol A, while they have endocrine and estrogen activity, they're not recognised by these detoxification enzymes as estrogens, and they pass straight through the placenta.
Scientists were first alerted to the potential effects of endocrine disruptors in wildlife species.
Fish in the rivers of the southeast of England, where 85% of the water flowing through those rivers is recycled sewage water, contains high levels of estrogenic compounds, and it was influencing the sexual differentiation of the fish. There's been similar data in Lake Apopka in Florida, where alligators have been found which have abnormalities of penile development, normal sexual development, which has been correlated with chemical spills into that lake beforehand.
This was the result of high-dose exposures where the impact on health is obvious. But establishing such chemical links to human health is harder. The link between chemicals and human disease is based largely on correlations, so it doesn't prove causation. That's why scientists have to rely on animal studies to support their hypotheses.
The research in animals is really very important indeed to try and get cause and effect. And if you look at some of the early studies in animals, for example, if you give a rat in development an endocrine disruptor and it's a male we're looking at, you often get changes in the development of the penis. So if you give estrogenic compounds during the development of that rat, then you will affect the penis. And that's a really good example of cause and effect. Whereas the studies in humans are looking at levels of chemicals we're exposed to and effects, and we never quite know whether they're linked.
And that's the challenge. To prove the effects in animals also occurs in humans.
There's something that has been termed the testicular dysgenesis syndrome, and this includes things like hypospadias, which is where the urethra does not exit at the tip of the penis. It's cryptorchidism, otherwise known as undescended testicles, which can cause sterility. There is low sperm count or impacts on sperm quality, mobility, and so on. And there's also testicular cancer.
In the past 30 years, the incidence of testicular cancer in Australia has increased by over 50%.
It's undeniable that this increase in testicular cancer is occurring. It's too fast to be entirely genetic and therefore likely to be something which is environmental.
Most men are diagnosed at around age 30, but the initial cause can be traced back to the womb.
Testis development is a very sensitive barometer of environmental toxicants. When these environmental chemicals hit the testis, there are some cells sitting in the testis that are of a very primitive kind, and they respond very abnormally to that signal and give you your testicular cancer.
In some countries, up to 40% of young men have poor semen quality. The link to toxicants is inconclusive, but certainly plausible.
Spermatozoa are just very susceptible to attack by chemicals, and the reason for that is very evident if you just look at them. They're composed of nothing more than basically a nucleus on top of a sperm tail. There's no space in there to put any protective enzymes that are going to help preserve the integrity of these cells.
But haven't we developed mechanisms to be able to deal with these kinds of toxins?
In the last century or so, we've introduced a whole new range of toxicants into the environment for which our defense mechanisms are not well adapted. And it's probably that lack of fit between our defense mechanisms and these new chemicals that have arrived in the environment that are responsible for these impacts that we're seeing on reproductive health.
The Endocrine Society, representing over 18,000 members, set out to update all the scientific evidence linking chemicals and endocrine-related disorders. Toxicologist at the University of Texas, Andrea Gore, spearheaded the report.
We knew that there were increases in infertility, there were disorders of puberty. People were noticing their girls were going through puberty at 9 and 10 years old instead of 11, 12, 13 years old, which is when they used to go through puberty. And the society began to wonder, and the endocrinologists began to wonder, whether there were chemicals in the environment that may be responsible for that change.
The way that puberty is stimulated in girls is for a quick shot of estrogen, which the girl begins to produce just before she goes into puberty. So if that girl is exposed to a hormone mimic, an estrogen mimic, an endocrine disruptor, that might well start that process. If you give rats a dose of estrogenic chemicals, endocrine disruptors that mimic the female hormone, they will also come into puberty earlier. So in animal studies, the connection is absolute. In human studies, it's not absolute, but the two things are together. The dose is crucially important for any toxicological consideration. Hormones work in infinitesimally tiny doses, and estrogenic chemicals work at infinitesimally tiny doses. So the sort of doses that you get in water and food from contamination from plasticizers or whatever are well within the range of doses to have a biological effect.
Canadian researcher Dr. Bruce Lanphier says even low levels of chemicals can have a significant impact on brain development.
And many of the chemicals that we're concerned about, like flame retardants, like lead, seem to be dopaminergic toxicants. They seem to disrupt the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that makes us most distinctly human. So that's particularly concerning to us, is when you start to monkey with that. That's the part of the brain that allows us to think fast on our feet, to be a CEO, to be a scientist, to have impulse control. And so if we start messing around with that, we're really dealing with a part of the brain that makes us human.
US data shows exposure to endocrine disruptors was also associated with a 5-point decrement in IQ.
When we see this on a population level, the impact is phenomenal. So take in the United States, if you shift the mean IQ by about 5 points, that results in an increase in the number of kids who are considered challenged, what we used to call mentally retarded, from about 6 million children to over 9 million children.
There's also a corresponding decrease of 2.4 million gifted children with high IQs.
So when you start to look at the impact of that, it's huge. What we're beginning to recognize, those of us that do this work, is that the pattern is pretty clear. We should expect that some of these chemicals will be toxic, and we should no longer be using our children as guinea pigs to find out when they are toxic.
Some chemicals are stored in the body for decades, whereas others are metabolized and excreted readily.
We have some chemicals like the persistent organic chemicals which tend to build up in your body over time. But there are other chemicals which have very, very short half-lives, and they are handled by the enzyme systems in our bodies. But at the same point, that doesn't mean we aren't exposed again and again and again and again. And we begin to see that even short-lived chemicals can have effects.
International media has shone a spotlight on the safety concerns of one of these short-lived chemicals, BPA, which is known to leach out of plastic into food and drink products.
I'd heard some reports in the media. So when I was pregnant, I was even more careful with the plastics I was using with my food. If I'd had a takeaway in a plastic container, I'd make sure that that wasn't reused because the food had been hot, and leftovers in glass dishes rather than plastic when I was storing them. I think from a consumer perspective, it's confusing because it hasn't been confirmed if BPA is harmful. It's not always labelled on the plastics. We don't know what other chemicals are also in the plastic that haven't been researched. We just don't know enough yet.
We don't necessarily know about the chemicals we're exposed to because there's no requirement on manufacturers to list all of the ingredients in products. There's no requirement to show that these chemicals are actually safe before people are exposed to them.
The chemicals that are used, for example, to make a water bottle don't need to undergo the same kind of safety scrutiny as a chemical that goes into a food product. Because making a water bottle, you're not intending for that chemical to get into the water. The problem is that it does get into the water through leaching.
As plastic degrades, like when left in the sun or put in dishwashers or microwaves, there's an accelerated leaching of plasticizers into the food or drink.
One of the most avoidable exposures that people are not as aware as they should be is heating food in microwaves in plastic containers. You can put them in Pyrex or glass containers. They're not going to have the same problem. Heating baby's milk in plastic bottles in a microwave is completely unnecessary. If you are going to heat it, don't put it in the plastic bottle. Children's books with recycled paper are full of plasticizers. We think it's quite cute that kids chew on their books, but you don't realise that they're actually exposing themselves to these plastic products quite unintentionally. The heat-sensitive paper in the cash register receipts are full of plastic products, bisphenols and phthalates.
We've just conducted a study where we've actually measured the levels of BPA in people who are cashiers. We measure it before shift, and then we measure it after an 8-hour shift. And in fact, what we see is an increase in their levels over the time of the shift. So we know that the way a cashier handles receipts can lead to elevated exposure.
It's still not clear whether this level of exposure poses a health risk. Author and TV presenter Sarah Wilson has spent the last few years trying to minimise her exposure to chemicals.
So what started you on this journey?
Well, 4 or 5 years ago, I found out that I had a pretty bad endocrinal issue, an autoimmune disease, and I knew that these endocrinal disruptors, were playing a part, or at least the science was pointing in that direction. I'd also come off the back of working in television quite solidly for a couple of years, where I was being slapped on with, makeup and hair products and so on. And I thought I should probably look into this.
It prompted Sarah to make some significant changes to her daily routine.
I've cleaned out my cosmetic case. I keep to single ingredient items wherever I can. I simply use less of those kinds of products. I find that I just don't need to use them as much. My cleaning products, I've changed a lot of those. I avoid canned foods. I avoid plastic containers. Shampoo is another area where I've made a difference as well. I use, sodium lauryl sulfate-free shampoos. I just figure wherever I can make a difference and it's not a big palaver, I might as well do it.
Do you think it's made a difference?
My skin has improved and my hair condition has changed as a result of not having all of that silicone and guff on my face and in my hair.
Sarah and I have sent off some blood samples to compare our level of endocrine disruptors. Has Sarah's changes made a difference? We'll reveal the results later. Recently, industry has responded to concerns. In Australia, for example, there's been a restriction of 1 phthalate in products used by infants up to 3 years of age. Also, many products now boast they're BPA-free. But are these products actually safer?
What you're not told is that they have other bisphenols in them, other agents like bisphenol S, bisphenol AF, bisphenol B, and the health effects of these are starting to become known as well.
On January 1 this year, France introduced legislation to suspend the use of BPA in packaged products that come into direct contact with food.
But industry groups are fighting back and calling for this ban to be overturned. Recently, the European Food Safety Authority has temporarily lowered the safe limit of BPA from 50 micrograms to 4 micrograms pending further studies. They estimate this is still 3 to 5 times lower than the highest daily exposure.
I think that level of 4 micrograms is rather an arbitrary number. There's really good evidence in the laboratory that levels of exposure much lower than 4 micrograms have effects on the developing brain, on the developing mammary gland, and may relate to mammary cancer, on the prostate gland, on the thyroid gland. So I do not believe that if a chemical is an endocrine disruptor, it can be considered safe at any level.
You go back, the same statement was made about lead. The same statement was made about mercury and PCBs and PBDEs. Time and again, it's the same story. They don't know. And you've seen this before, right? You look at study after study, we don't know, we don't know, we don't know. Now this is harmful.
So you disagree with the regulatory bodies?
Yes. The regulatory system that's been set up assumes that these chemicals are safe until proven otherwise. And so what the regulatory authorities are doing, what our governments are doing, are basically saying we don't have enough evidence to show that these are guilty yet. So until we have definitive evidence from the laboratory, from a number of human studies, we're going to continue to treat them as though they're innocent. So in the end, what we're doing, each time we release another chemical onto the market that hasn't been sufficiently tested, is we're doing this massive experiment on our children, on all of us. I think what's happening is we're waiting for that crisis.
Many of us are concerned that the people who are involved in the decision-making process are being influenced by groups that have a vested interest in those products. I consider it a conflict of interest if you make a product and then you test that product yourself and say that it's safe, to then use that as the basis for regulatory policy. I believe it's absolutely critical to bring in researchers who have no conflict of interest, who are not financially invested in a product, and let them do the research in a controlled way, and then make sure that that research is carefully peer-reviewed.
Food Standards Australia New Zealand says that the weight of scientific evidence indicates that the levels of BPA exposure pose no public health and safety concerns for consumers. They also said they assess both independent and industry-sponsored studies, and that they continue to review new information as it becomes available. One difficulty faced by regulators and scientists is trying to assess the safety of multiple chemicals.
When determining the toxic effects of a chemical, it's often done one chemical at a time. But this scenario is hardly a reality.
People are very seldom exposed to a single chemical at a time. We're exposed to chemical mixtures. And most people who study in the area study one chemical at a time because it's technically easier. It's much more difficult to study mixtures than study the effects of mixtures. But the reality is people are exposed to mixtures of chemicals all the time.
Now, my feeling is that we should be regulating chemicals like BPA, because I think their combined effect is really quite significant. But it's very difficult for regulators to take account of the levels of everything in the environment and consider BPA in the context of that cocktail. So each chemical is looked at individually, and the individual levels are all far too low to have an effect, but the combined effect is what's important.
There are ways that individuals can try to minimise their exposure.
If you wash your fruit and vegetables, you remove most of the residual pesticides. If you buy fresh foods instead of packaged foods, you're not exposing yourself to any contaminants that leach into your food or water. You also minimize creating a lot of trash, like the empty water bottles that are now getting into the oceans and the landfills. We can also keep our houses clean and thereby minimize having to spray with chemicals to try to get rid of the pests.
You can choose to eat organic if you can afford it. Try to eat fresh, unpackaged foods. Avoid canned foods. I tell my daughters this all the time. They don't listen. Don't use cosmetics. There's a lot of things in cosmetics. Invariably, every year there'll be another study about lead in lipstick. Phthalates are big in cosmetics. So I try to tell my daughters, you're beautiful like you are. And it doesn't work.
Since these are the kinds of changes Sarah has made, I'm curious to see whether her levels of endocrine disruptors are lower than mine.
What did these blood samples tell us?
So, Marianne, what we have on the screen here is the results of your blood and Sarah's blood and average Australian women's blood.
It turns out that overall, Sarah and I had similar results, and our levels were slightly below the average Australian female.
Overall, our results seem to be fairly similar. Are you surprised given that Sarah goes out of her way to avoid these chemicals and I don't?
Unfortunately, I'm not surprised. I think this is a reflection of the fact that these chemicals are everywhere and we don't know exactly what products they're in. If we don't know what they're in, it makes it much more difficult to avoid them.
Without clear labelling on products, consumers are exposed to many chemicals unknowingly.
It's an absolute minefield out there. I don't think the average person could ever get round to understanding the labelling. It's the Wild West. Chemicals are absolutely everywhere. I'm trying to make a difference, and it's not just because of my own personal health. It also just makes sense from an environmental point of view and also a financial point of view. The less guff that you have in your life, the simpler your life is, and hopefully the healthier it can be.
And you feel better for it?
I feel much better for it, yeah. I feel like my life is cleaner.
Now, there are populations like the Amish that shun modern technology and have significantly lower levels of BPA and phthalates. But this is unrealistic for most. A better way to control our exposure to environmental chemicals is through government regulation. In 2004, the Stockholm Convention ratified an international treaty to target chemicals with known impact on human health. The list, known as the Dirty Dozen, includes chemicals such as pesticides like DDT and industrial chemicals like PCBs. For more than a decade, this lab in Queensland has measured the level of these chemicals in the Australian population. They found that the levels of DDT have decreased by more than a factor of 10 since the 1970s, while some brominated flame retardants in children have decreased to less than half the concentrations 10 years ago.
You can really see that the Stockholm Treaty works because it really led to the decrease of these chemicals in human serum in Australia.
So it's a good news story.
That's a great story, and I think it shows that regulation works.
So is it possible that these chemicals might be substituted with others of unknown safety?
There's definitely a chance. I think that's what happens, that when you regulate one group of chemicals, the industry sees a need to replace it with some other chemicals. And so the way chemicals are regulated and considered to be safe are not bulletproof.
It's almost like a human experiment.
Unfortunately, yes.
Fear-mongering never helps anybody, but denying the existence of concerns is equally harmful. I strongly believe that you have to act when you have concerning information in the absence of certainty, because science is rarely ever 100% certain.
It would be something like the smoking debate, where it wasn't until the horse had bolted that we suddenly realized that there was a link between smoking and lung cancer. The data was there suggesting this many decades before, but we were very slow to react to it. We don't want to be slow to react to this because reproductive toxicants are something which are going to impact upon us all. I don't think future generations will forgive us if we turn our back on this information and do nothing with it.
If you accept that the lag period between early life exposure and chronic disease in later life might be 50 years or so, then we're exposing generations of children and people to problems. Now, we know that these chemicals are already in people's bodies. There's enough evidence to suggest that they are harmful and that there's no benefit for them being there. So it makes perfect sense to me to act now rather than waiting for 50 years till we get definitive evidence.
For more information about chemical exposure, visit our website.